In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt created the nation's first national monument designation. The purpose of this designation was to preserve for all Americans significant pieces of the country's history, ecology, geology, and beauty. All national monuments are designated by U.S. presidents and are chosen as their personal memorials of those most special parts of this great country. Memorials that they see a need to protect over all others. Some are big, some are small. Some garner large budgets and staff. Others, next to none. All were chosen by presidents who considered them the most important places to protect over all other places in the country. America's national monuments tell the story of the nation's past and present glory. Hello, I'm Jordan Murphy, and I will be your guide as we visit 12 national monuments located in America's southern states and territories. The worst war in American history was the Civil War, North against South. The 3 national monuments in this program help us understand why this war happened, how it began, and how a turning point in warfare helped lead the North to victory. The statue behind me is that of George Washington Carver. He was one of America's greatest scientists, but he was also born a slave. Near Joplin, Missouri, George Washington Carver National Monument tells the story of his life and the events that led up to the Civil War.
Tucked along the western edge of the Ozarks is a monument dedicated to one of the greatest men this nation has ever produced, George Washington Carver. Established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on April 5, 1943, the George Washington Carver National Monument is only one of 3 dedicated to an individual. The monument preserves the land where Carver was born, preserves the land that inspired Carver to greatness. The centerpiece of the park is a 1-mile trail that leads you through dense woodlands, across peaceful streams, and by the quiet ponds that meant so much to young Carver as he grew up. It also introduces you to his wise and environmentally enlightened philosophy through a series of plaques placed along the trail. The sun rises on the old Susan and Moses Carver farm. A rooster crows as it must have over 150 years ago. It was the height of the Civil War, 1864 to be precise. The trail begins with the forlorn outline of the 12-by-12 cabin where George Washington Carver was born to his slave mother Mary in that same year. His father was unknown. It was from this cabin that the infant Carver and his mother were kidnapped by Confederate raiders and sold to slave traders in Arkansas. Remarkably, by the efforts of the farm owner Moses Carver, baby George was returned to the farm. Sadly, his mother was killed in Arkansas. George was an orphan. Raised by the white Carver family until he was 12, George was nurtured by this land. On being an orphan, he said, "There was a great purpose in that I was just an orphan boy wandering around trying to find a place. In some way or another, I did not allow myself to get bitter. It is forgotten. A boardwalk leads to the famous Robert Amendola sculpture of Carver as a young boy. In his hand is a plant, root and all. Many are the tears I have shed because I would break the roots or flowers of some of my pets while removing them from the ground. And strange to say, all sorts of vegetation seemed to thrive under my touch until I was styled the plant doctor. The sculpture is set in the deciduous forest of oaks and walnut trees, stunning in their vibrant fall colors. The undergrowth is rich with lichens and mosses, a wonderland of nature for young George. More and more as we come closer and closer in touch with nature and its teaching, we are able to see the divine and are therefore fitted to interpret correctly the various languages spoken by all forms of nature about us. The trail crosses the Carver branch of the Shoal River. Then it's on to the spring-fed Williams Pond and the contemplative Loop Trail. I love to think of nature as an unlimited broadcasting system through which God speaks to us every hour, if we will only tune in. Adjacent to the pond is a restored tall grass prairie. A brilliant bouquet of prairie flowers blossoms during the spring and summer, and a bouquet of fall flowers bursts alive in September and October. At the apex of the trail is the historic Carver Homestead. Built in 1881, after a tornado wiped away the original buildings, it is where the Carver family lived after George left for school. It was to improving farms like this that Carver devoted his life. The primary idea in all of my work was to help the farmer and fill the poor man's empty dinner pail. My idea was to help the man farthest down. This is why I have made every process just as simple as I could to put it within his reach. The last stop along the trail is the Carver Family Cemetery. Although George is not buried here, his adopted parents, Susan and Moses, are. No individual has any right to come into this world and go out of it without leaving behind him distinct and legitimate reasons for having passed through it. The highlight of the Monument's Visitor Center is 3 of Carver's original artworks. There is no shortcut to achievement. Life requires thorough preparation. Veneer isn't worth anything. However, it is along the trail deep in the woods, where as a young boy Carver observed and cared for the plants he discovered, that the presence of George Washington Carver can be felt. George Washington Carver National Monument is part of the Ozark Mountain System. The Ozark Plateau is around 50,000 square miles, covering sections of the states of Kansas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and a good portion of Missouri. The Ozarks are ancient. The bedrock outcrops that make up the Ozarks are dolomites and sandstones from the oldest era of life, the Paleozoic Age. These sediments are in distinct contrast to the younger flat-lying rocks that surround the Ozarks. How did the Ozarks come to be? 450 million years ago, a continental plate crashed into North America along the continent's east coast. This was part of the event that produced the supercontinent, Pangaea. The result of this tectonic activity was the formation and uplifting of the Appalachian mountain chain, which included what is now the Ozarks. When the uplifting ceased, a new process began: weathering and erosion. Then around 200 million years ago, as Pangaea was breaking apart, the separation of the continents created a great rift valley right in the middle of what would become the United States. A rift valley that is now filled by the Mississippi River Basin. The result was not only an earthquake-prone area that is still active today, but it also separated the Ozark Highlands from the rest of the Appalachian mountain chain. Today, the Ozarks are highly weathered and dissected by the many rivers and streams that flow from the thousands of springs that originate here. The weathering of the ancient Paleozoic rocks has exposed rich deposits of lead and zinc ore. However, the weathering of this rock has also produced nutrient-poor soil, which is not conducive to large-scale agriculture, making the Ozarks in the 21st century one of the poorer rural areas of the country. Prior to settlement in the early 1800s, the Ozarks supported one of the great eastern broadleaf forests. The primary species of this forest are the pointy-leafed red oaks and the smooth-leafed white oaks. The oaks are punctuated by a smattering of hickory and walnut trees. Today, only 3% of the original hardwood forest remains. But the forests are making a comeback as the Ozarks transition from agricultural to recreational land use. Recreational land use that is based on the many reservoir lakes that have become the signature feature of this ancient highland. The man who the George Washington Carver National Monument honors was a most extraordinary scientist, educator, inventor, painter, and visionary. In short, a Renaissance man. All of this is so remarkable because of what he had to overcome. He started life as an orphan black slave child, growing up in the South. A childhood disease affected his vocal cords so that he sounded like this his whole life.
The day is here. Tomorrow is lighting up the distant horizon with new and unheard of gleams, fraught with almost unlimited possibilities for everyone who is prepared to do what the world wants done.
George Washington Carver has been an inspiration to Park Ranger Curtis Gregory.
He left here about the age of 12 years old, and from that point he was on his own for the rest of his life, struggling the entire way, getting schooling whenever he could, working most of the time, and he never gave up his dream of getting an education and becoming as he would say, helping his people as much as he could. And so I think that George is very important because of his I can attitude and never giving up his goals or his dreams. What George means to me personally is that he was an individual that, again, that he had certain goals at a time when society wasn't very kind to African Americans. And he never gave up, again, his I can attitude where he could have, and he could have been very successful after he got an education, but he wanted to help his people. And he wanted to help his people as much as he could. And it brings back home a lot of Carver's ideals and things like that to me as well.
The most far-reaching of ideas, in retrospect, was the one that started right here in his first 12 years. That of the balance of nature, which during his life translated into the understanding of the need for environmentally sound, sustainable technologies. Incredibly, Carver knew in the early part of the 20th century what we in the first part of the 21st century need to do. Carver, being a black man, also participated in the events surrounding the Great Divide that has plagued the country since the first black slaves arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Racial conflict. Indeed, the state into which Carver was born, Missouri, was pivotal in the events leading up to the Civil War. Settled in the early part of the 19th century by slave-owning Southerners, Missouri would become a pivotal state in the fight over slavery. The first clash came when Missouri petitioned to join the Union in 1818. Northerners did not want another slave state, and Southerners did. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise temporarily settled the conflict by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. The compromise also banned slavery from the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Missouri, except in the state of Missouri. This uneasy truce lasted 30 years. The next quarrel erupted in 1850 when Northern abolitionist senators wanted to use the admission of California as a free state to overturn the Missouri Compromise. War between the states was narrowly averted by the Compromise of 1850. It was a series of congressional acts which included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act. No one was happy. The final straw that forced the nation towards civil war was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott, a black slave now living in Missouri, went to court to get his freedom. The case went to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1857, the court ruled against Scott. At the same time, it ruled the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because all slaves were property, and Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories without violating a slave owner's constitutional right to own property. War loomed between the North and the South. And 4 years later, the bloodiest conflict on American soil began. Though during the war, Missouri was a border state, a state on the side of the Union, it spawned many Confederate guerrilla groups who fought to keep slavery, including those men who stole George Washington Carver and his mother and took them into the deep South. After the Civil War, Carver was part of that group of black men and women: Frederick Douglass, Robert Smalls, Ida B. Wells, and Booker T. Washington, who showed they were equal to any in this country. They were the first wave of black heroes. George Washington Carver joined Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in 1896, where he researched and taught until his death in 1943. A life well lived by the boy who loved nature.
On that small island in the bay outside of Charleston, South Carolina, sits one of the most hallowed shrines of the Civil War. Fort Sumter National Monument preserves the site where it all began.
No city of the Deep South embodies the region's heart and soul more than South Carolina's Charleston. It is the region's oldest city, established in 1670. And during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, the South's most historically significant. Fort Sumter National Monument captures those early historic moments by preserving two pivotal forts that guarded the entrance to Charleston Harbor. Today, these two forts echo with passionate cries from the long-ago battles for freedom and self-determination. This most historic of national monuments was set aside by President Harry Truman in 1948. One unit of the monument is Fort Moultrie on Sullivan Island. In 1776, the fort played a critical role in the nation's fight for freedom during the Revolutionary War.
Fort Moultrie is the site of the first major victory in the American Revolution. It was won by the Patriots there on June 28, 1776. It defeated a British naval force trying to come in and capture Charleston, South Carolina.
Today, it is a showcase of 170 years of the country's coastal fortifications. Artillery from the Civil War to World War II is on display here. From the fort's cannon deck, another fort is visible in the middle of the Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. Reachable only by boat, the whole history of the American Civil War unfolds here on these sacred grounds. It was built on a man-made island, 4 acres in size.
The fort was a 5-sided pentagon-shaped structure with exterior walls 5 feet thick, 52 feet high, and the fort was designed to hold 135 guns within its walls and have living quarters inside for 650 officers and men. By 1860, it was about 90% complete, and at that point, South Carolina seceded from the Union and construction stopped.
Only part of the fort is still preserved today.
We're here on the parade ground of Fort Sumter. About a mile from where I'm standing to the east is Fort Moultrie, which played an important role in the bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th, 1861. Here on the parade ground, you can see various levels of Fort Sumter's history. Of course, around us are the ruins of the fort, which show us somewhat what the fort looked like in 1861, but at the same time with these ruins, we can see what the fort looked like as a result of the bombardment starting in 1863. Behind me, you see some of the ruins of the officers' quarters. These were 3-story high townhouse or condominium-like living structures for those officers. And then also behind me, you can see a brick flooring, and that's the remains of a 3-story high enlisted men's barracks. Also over here, we have Battery Isaac UG, which was built for the Spanish-American War in 1898. That occupies the middle third of the fort. So right now we're only seeing about a third of the fort in its original size, just on the parade ground. This is one of the types of cannons used in the bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th, 1861. Both North and South had these types of guns. This was a 32-pounder smoothbore gun.
Other cannons on display within the fort are a battery of the famous rifled cannons that changed 19th century warfare forever. Sullivan Island, the site of Fort Moultrie, presents a wonderful opportunity to see one of the basic dynamic operating forces in ecology, plant succession. Plant succession is the slow process of one plant community replacing another as an area moves from pioneer plant species to a climax forest or climax grassland. Here at the monument, this process can be observed by walking along one of the trails that leads from the beach to the fort. Each day, the ocean's waves wash up tons of sand, forming a beachfront. Some of that sand is blown into ever-shifting dunes. Now plants take over. First, pioneer grasses begin the process of succession by stabilizing the dunes. Move a little further inland, and now the dunes have become stable, and the pioneering grasses have been replaced by low-lying shrubs and a variety of flowering plants. As we move even further inland, the land is now covered by a thick tangle of shrubs and emerging trees. The next step of coastal plant succession reveals that the understory is beginning to open up, and there is now a thick tree canopy overhead. The last step of succession in this area is the emergence of a coastal hardwood forest. A jungle dominated by live oaks and palm trees with a largely open understory. The whole process can take hundreds of years, but within the monument can be seen in the space of a 30-yard walk. The headline of the Charleston newspaper summed it up: "The Union is dissolved." On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Soon, other Southern states followed, and in February of 1861, they elected Jefferson Davis president of the Confederacy. Earlier, Major Anderson had moved his loyal Union troops from Fort Moultrie to the more defensible Fort Sumter. Throughout the winter and early spring, tension mounted between Sumter and the Confederate troops surrounding the island fort.
Charleston was the most important seaport on the South Atlantic coast of this new country, the Confederate States of America. They could not allow now a foreign power, the United States, to control the most important fort that could control all the shipping that would go in and out of this port of Charleston. Because out of here would go the rice, the cotton, the tobacco, and other products that the South would need for commerce to trade with European powers and countries to maintain their independence and nationhood. So they had to get the Federals out of here, and they would do it either by negotiation or by artillery fire if they had to.
So when Major Anderson refused to surrender, as they say, the rest was history.
At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a 10-inch mortar shell was fired from Fort Johnson, located about 1.25 miles from Fort Sumter. That shell exploded directly over top of the fort. That was a signal for all the Confederate guns that could bear on Fort Sumter to open fire. And so at that point, 43 Confederate guns and mortars would fire on the fort for the next 34 hours, firing well over 3,000 artillery projectiles at Fort Sumter. So finally the fort would surrender when it was on fire on the afternoon of April 13th, 1861.
From that point on, Charleston became a major gap in the Union's naval blockade of the Atlantic coast. And its forts would see many more battles.
Probably the most significant event that would happen here would begin on July 10th, 1863, when the siege of Charleston began by the United States Army and Navy. This would mark the longest siege of the war, running 587 days from July 10th, 1863 until February 17th, 1865. And Fort Sumter would be the focal point of that siege by the United States Army and Navy. Over the course of the siege, the United States Army and Navy would fire approximately 7 million pounds of artillery projectiles at Fort Sumter, making it the most heavily bombarded 2.5 acres on this continent in warfare. What would happen is when General Sherman's army captures Columbia, South Carolina on February 17, 1865, the Confederates down here in Charleston would evacuate all their positions in and around Charleston, and the next day, February 18, 1865, the United States forces would move in, and the war would now be over with here at Fort Sumter and Charleston.
52 days later, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee would surrender to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the costliest war in American history. A war that started right here at Fort Sumter.
The fortifications here at Fort Pulaski National Monument near Savannah, Georgia, were supposed to be impregnable, but they weren't. This is the story of how on one day, April 11th, 1862, the nature of warfare was changed forever.
A giant container ship enters the mouth of the Savannah River, gliding past Cockspur Island en route to Savannah Harbor. Today, as it has been for over 200 years, this port is key to the economic success of the South. What the crew members of the ships see as they pass by the island is an old brick Civil War fort, Fort Pulaski. Named after the Revolutionary War hero, Polish-born Count Casimir Pulaski, who was killed by the British during the siege of Savannah in 1779 near this island. Designated a national monument in 1924 by President Calvin Coolidge, Fort Pulaski is an engineering marvel that a young Robert E. Lee helped design.
Corps of Engineers surveyed it, and in fact, Robert E. Lee, on one of his very first assignments as a newly graduated, newly minted engineer from West Point, came here, situated the fort on the island, and actually drew the drawings for the constructions of earthen dikes to hold back the salt marsh. The uplands that you see on Cockspur Island were all engineered by the Corps of Engineers within the historic dike system. And then the land that we're standing on today, as well as any uplands that you see, are mainly as a result of man-made intervention. This was all marshland during that period, even up until today.
Now restored, the fortress is surrounded by a moat. In the quiet waters, turtles pop up their heads. A drawbridge leads into the fort. Inside, on the spacious parade grounds, Union soldiers prepare to fire the kind of rifled cannon that played such a pivotal role in the story of Fort Pulaski and in the eventual outcome of the Civil War. From the cannon deck, the scale and magnificence of the fort spreads out below. Surrounding the parade grounds are the living quarters, storage areas, and command center. Outside, in front of the drawbridge, are the earthworks that once covered the powder magazine. However, it comes with some surprise when circling to the back side of the fort to see the crumbling brick from one devastating cannon impact after another. Reminders of what happened here in 1862. The history of Fort Pulaski goes back to another American war, the War of 1812, fought against the British. During this war, the nation found that its harbors were defenseless from British invasion. So much so that Washington, D.C. was easily captured by a British fleet. When the war was over, politicians were driven to build a system of defensive coastal forts. Up until then, America's coastline had been virtually without forts.
The Army Corps of Engineers built the system of coastal fortifications to protect the United States from foreign invasion, and they selected this island, Cockspur Island, for the coastal protection of the Port of Savannah, which this island's actually had 3 fortifications: a colonial fort, an early American fort, and then this Civil War era fort, which historians refer to as a third system fortification.
The purpose of the forts, like Pulaski, was to keep harbors open for trade, and in this case, protected from attack by enemy ships. Once the Civil War broke out, it was critical to the South's chances of success to take control of the southern coastal forts, which were only lightly manned by loyal Union troops.
The governor of Georgia, he orders his troops in Savannah to come out and occupy Fort Pulaski.
Now it became critical to the North's success to take back the Confederate-controlled coastal forts.
President Lincoln had made a determination that they needed to take some of these coastal fortifications and ports to deny the South their economic power, the power of selling cotton.
Knowing this, General Lee decided to make Fort Pulaski the final line of defense for the Confederates' most important harbor, Savannah, Georgia. Lee personally took command of the fort he had helped build more than 30 years earlier.
And he says you need to do certain things inside the fort to protect the soldiers, to protect the powder magazine. But he said as far as Tybee Island, as far as the closest place where the Federals could stage an attack, it's a mile and a half away. And in that period of time, conventional wisdom said that a cannon firing a smooth bore cannonball only had an effective range to breach fortifications of about a mile. And so Lee says this quote, he says, "They can make it hot for you with shells, but at that distance they cannot breach." So what we have here is really an interesting situation. One of the greatest military minds this country has ever produced, Robert E. Lee, says that this fort can't be beat. They're invulnerable. They're invincible. And it was really that quest for invulnerability that spawned this whole system of coastal fortifications. That story and that quest will come to an end at the seminal battle, the siege and reduction of Fort Pulaski, April 10th and 11th, 1862.
On those 2 days, not only would Fort Pulaski fall, but the nature of warfare would be changed forever. It came as a result of a new strategy by the Union commander.
He's going to be using some new technology that's called rifled cannons. This is a cannon that has a rifling on the inside, and instead of firing a spherical shell, it fires a bullet-shaped projectile. This gives the technology more accuracy, more range, and more penetrating power. In fact, there was a rifled cannon inside Fort Pulaski that the Confederates had. What is new about what Gilmore does is he concentrates the weapons. He puts all of the rifled cannons into 2 batteries. He also places them at the closest location on Goat Point of Tybee Island, about a mile and a half away. He concentrates the firepower together in those 2 batteries, but he also concentrates where he directs that firepower. The Federals built the fort. They have the plans of Fort Pulaski. They know where the powder magazine is. They know if they attack the angle of the fort that faces Tybee Island and that they can breach that angle, they will have a clear field of fire across the fort to the powder magazine. This is their plan. Something like this has never been tried before. This fort is considered invincible. General Totten, who was the commander of the Federal forces and helped build a lot of these forts, he said, you might as well bombard the Rocky Mountains as bomb Fort Pulaski. And again, it's part of our country's quest for invulnerability. That's what Fort Pulaski was all about. 7.5 feet of brick. Robert E. Lee said it couldn't be breached at that distance. And yet Gilmore does the impossible in less than 30 hours. Once you had rifled cannons against brick fortifications, coastal defense of the United States was changed forever. There was a new offense, but on April 11th, 1862, there was no new defense. So they had a powerful weapon, but no new defense against Europe, which was what these forts were designed for. It's a turning point in military history, and it signals the end of the role of all masonry fortifications around the world.
On those 2 eventful days, the 1,000-year era of castles and stone fortifications came to an end. This is the legacy of Fort Pulaski. Cockspur Island. The island Fort Pulaski was built on was engineered from a salt marsh. Salt marshes are one of the most uniquely adapted ecosystems on the planet. The plants that make up the salt marshes, grasses and rushes, thrive in brackish water that would kill most grasses, shrubs, and trees. Not only are salt marshes adapted to salt water, but they also endure the rising and falling of tides. Located along coasts, estuaries, and waterways between the barrier islands and the mainland, salt marshes are one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. They're often frequented by many birds, reptiles, and fish. An ecosystem related to the salt marshes in the southeastern United States are mangroves. Growing along the water's edge, mangrove trees are also adapted to saltwater and tides. Their tripod-like root systems have a deeply primeval feel. Today, a bridge takes the visitor across a beautiful salt marsh to and from Fort Pulaski. A salt marsh that witnessed the groundbreaking military events that changed the world forever.
Thanks for joining me on our tour of some of the Old South's most sacred Civil War grounds. I'm Jordan Murphy.